In late September of 2012, 32-year-old photographer Michael Reeves set out alone into Utah's Canyonlands National Park. Friends said he was pursuing a personal project, capturing the canyon country in transition, the way light shifted over rock mesas at the change of season. His last known text to his sister read simply, "Signals fading. Back in a few days." He parked his car at a remote trailhead near the Needles district and signed his name in the trail register. It was never crossed out. When Reeves failed to return, the National Park Service initiated a search on October 3rd. Rangers followed his planned route down into Elephant Canyon and across to Druid Arch, an area he had mentioned as a focus of his trip. Helicopters swept the canyons, volunteers scoured trails, and dogs were deployed. Dispatch logs from those first days paint a bleak picture. Scent terminated at dry wash, negative tracks beyond. His camp stove, tent, and extra water remained neatly packed in his vehicle. The only certainty was that he had gone into the backcountry with his camera gear and never emerged. Search leaders considered the harsh terrain. In October, temperatures still soared above 90 degrees during the day and plummeted at night. Water sources were scarce, trails confusing. Officially, the working theory was that Reeves miscalculated, suffered dehydration or a fall, and his body was concealed by the rugged landscape. After 12 days without evidence, the search was scaled back. But even then, inconsistencies troubled the Rangers. Reeves was experienced in the backcountry, familiar with the desert environment. His friends noted he always carried redundant water systems and GPS backups. He wasn't reckless, one ranger later said in an interview. Something didn't fit. Still, without remains, the case was quietly closed. The file was stamped, "Missing, presumed deceased." For nearly a decade, the story drifted into obscurity. Reeves became another name on the long list of hikers lost in the Canyonlands, swallowed by sandstone and silence. His family held small vigils, clinging to fading hope but receiving no answers. Then, in 2021, a discovery jolted the case back into the light. That spring, a trail crew clearing brush near Salt Creek stumbled on a buried object, exposed after flash flooding tore through the arroyo. Wrapped in deteriorated canvas was a camera, Reeves's DSLR confirmed by serial number. Despite water damage, the memory card inside remained intact. Forensic technicians recovered 183 photographs taken in the final days of his trip. None had been transmitted or uploaded. They had remained sealed underground for 9 years. The images began predictably. Sweeping panoramas of the canyons, striated cliffs under the midday sun, delicate arches illuminated at dawn. But as investigators scrolled deeper into the sequence, the tone shifted. Later photos depicted crude rock cairns, stacked in unnatural shapes. Some showed spirals traced into sand. Others depicted shadows stretched across canyon walls that did not align with the time of day. In one frame, a blurred figure seemed to appear at the edge of the shot, tall, indistinct, watching. The final images, captured just before the camera went dark, showed a series of close-ups. Reeves's own boots in sand, the mouth of a narrow slot canyon, and a last haunting frame of the desert sky, night stars overlaid by a streak of pale light. The metadata confirmed the timestamps extended several days beyond when Reeves was believed to have vanished. His camera, at least, had survived longer than the official timeline allowed. The FBI quietly took possession of the device, citing the possibility of criminal evidence. They released only 20 of the images to Reeves's family, all of them benign landscape shots. The other 163 remain unreleased. Internal lab notes, later leaked, described the missing frames as sensitive content, requires classification review. Officials refused to elaborate. The re-emergence of the camera ignited speculation. Had Reeves buried it himself, intending for it to be found later? Or had someone else placed it there, deliberately sealed in canvas to withstand time? Rangers revisiting the site noted the burial was too neat, too intentional. as if meant to preserve the record. Reeves's family pressed for answers. His sister told reporters, if he was lost, why would he keep photographing? Why would he take pictures of shadows, of things that shouldn't be there? What was he trying to show us? The discovery turned the Reeves case from forgotten tragedy into an unresolved mystery. Each of the 183 photos hinted at a narrative never completed, an unfinished testimony buried beneath the desert floor. The silence of the officials, the missing frames, and the fact the camera lay hidden for nearly a decade all suggested a story larger than the disappearance of one man. 9 years after he vanished, Reeves had spoken again, not with words, but with images, blurred, eerie, and unsent. And they left behind the same question that haunted his family and investigators alike. What did he see in the Canyonlands, and why did he never return? When the camera surfaced in 2021, the official search narrative had to be revisited, but only in fragments. Rangers were summoned back to the site where the flash flood had exposed the buried object. The coordinates placed the camera almost 4 miles from Reeves's intended route in a section of Salt Creek that was rarely traveled and not included in the original search grids. Dispatch logs from the day of recovery note, unclear why area not covered in 2012. Terrain difficult, no trails leading in. The omission raised immediate questions. Had Reeves deliberately gone off route, or had he been led there by something not yet understood? Forensic teams worked carefully to preserve the contents of the memory card. Recovery reports describe how the final sequence of photos contained metadata that extended Reeves's survival window by at least 3 days beyond the presumed date of his death. This meant that while the official search was combing the canyons, Reeves may have still been alive, documenting something he could not explain. Internal notes leaked later referenced continuing activity well past presumed expiration, a phrase that disturbed investigators more than it clarified. Witness interviews from 2012 resurfaced in the wake of the discovery. A pair of German tourists had reported hearing a whistle echoing through the canyons on October 6th, 3 days after the official start of the search. At the time, it was dismissed as natural acoustics, wind funneling through narrow slots, but their description matched the timeline suggested by the camera. Another hiker recalled seeing a flash of light near Druid Arch late at night, like a flare without sound. His statement, recorded in a ranger's notebook, never made it into the final file. When asked about these inconsistencies, officials remained silent. Press briefings emphasized that no new human remains were found with the camera and that nothing in the recovered photographs directly indicated foul play. But privately, rangers admitted the photos unsettled them. One described seeing images of stone stacks arranged like symbols, not trail markers. Too deliberate. Too strange. Another recalled that a blurred frame appeared to show multiple figures on a ridge, none of whom were accounted for in search records. Families demanded access to all 183 photographs, but the FBI released only the landscapes, omitting the most disturbing frames. The justification given was privacy concerns, though no one could explain how spirals in sand or blurred shadows violated privacy. A retired ranger later said, "They weren't hiding faces, they were hiding patterns." Speculation spread quickly. Some suggested Reeves stumbled on illegal activity in the backcountry, drug operations, looters of ancient sites, or clandestine testing tied to nearby defense facilities. Others pointed to older stories, canyon legends of the Watchers that had circulated among locals for generations. Archaeologists noted that spirals, like the ones photographed in the sand, were common in petroglyphs across the Southwest, symbols linked to migration, portals, or boundaries. What troubled investigators most was the final stretch of the camera's journey. Soil analysis confirmed that the canvas wrap had preserved the camera under nearly 3 feet of compacted sand. The depth suggested deliberate burial, not accidental coverage by wind or floods. Whoever placed it there had intended it to survive. Whether it was Reeves himself leaving behind a record, or someone else who wanted those images found much later, remains unresolved. The second chapter of the Reeves case ended not with answers, but with a deeper fracture between the official narrative and the fragments of truth that slipped through. His disappearance was no longer simply the story of a man lost in desert canyons. It had become the story of a buried testimony, 183 photographs, most hidden from public view, that suggested Reeves had seen something in the Canyonlands no one was prepared to explain. In the months following the recovery of Michael Reeves's camera, independent investigators began piecing together what the official record refused to clarify. The 183 photographs, though largely withheld, circulated quietly in fragments. Journalists gained access to a handful of leaked images, grainy, partially corrupted files showing patterns in the desert floor that did not match natural formations. One photograph revealed a spiral traced into sand, another a lattice of stones arranged in a cross-like geometry. Both bore unsettling similarities to petroglyphs carved centuries earlier into canyon walls only miles from where Reeves had disappeared. Archaeologists familiar with the region noted the resemblance, but avoided making public statements. The metadata embedded in the photos raised further contradictions. The last image was time-stamped October 9th, 6 days after Reeves was believed to have vanished, and 3 days after the official search had scaled back. This meant Reeves, or at least his camera, was still active in the wilderness while searchers combed the area. Yet during that period, no ground or aerial teams reported sightings of fires, tents, or movement. Dispatch records do, however, contain anomalies. On October 8th, at 23:17 hours, a helicopter pilot reported seeing unidentified points of light moving in formation along the canyon rim. The pilot's note was struck from the final file, but a log technician later admitted the entry existed. The absence of Reeves's body only sharpened the contradictions. Rangers initially argued that his remains had been carried off by wildlife, a plausible scenario in desert backcountry. But if so, why did the camera survive, wrapped carefully in canvas, preserved under compacted sand? Soil compression analysis suggested deliberate burial, not incidental coverage by floods or winds. Investigators noted that the burial site was stable enough to shield the camera from years of monsoons and erosion. Someone had intended it to remain hidden until uncovered by chance or by time. Forensic analysis of the memory card yielded another discovery. Alongside the images were corrupted audio fragments, likely from the camera's built-in microphone. One clip, when cleaned by audio engineers, revealed faint ambient sounds: steady wind, Reeves's footsteps, and something else, a low, rhythmic knocking, echoing as though from stone. Another clip captured Reeves whispering, "Still following," before the file cut off abruptly. The FBI categorized these recordings as non-relevant artifacts, but investigators who heard them insisted they were authentic. Witness accounts that had been dismissed in 2012 resurfaced with renewed significance. A ranger stationed near the Needles recalled hearing faint whistles at night during the search, not the wind's howl, but deliberate three-note sequences. He mentioned it once in a debrief, but was told to stick to verifiable observations. A pair of hikers reported seeing flashes of light in Salt Creek, like camera flashes, though no other parties were believed to be in the area. At the time, these statements were filed under unsubstantiated. In light of the recovered photographs, they appeared less coincidental. Reeves's family became increasingly vocal. His sister, who had received his last text before he lost signal, accused authorities of concealing the full truth. "We know he kept photographing," she told reporters. "Why won't they let us see what he saw?" A lawyer representing the family filed motions to access the complete set of 183 images, but the FBI refused, citing ongoing classification review. This raised new questions. What about simple photographs of desert spirals, or Cairns' required classification at the federal level? Speculation spiraled outward. Some linked Reeves's disappearance to older cases in Canyonlands and surrounding areas. hikers vanishing without trace, belongings recovered in inexplicable arrangements. In 1998, two climbers were reported missing near Horseshoe Canyon. Their shoes were found stacked neatly against a boulder, their bodies never recovered. In 2005, a solo backpacker vanished in the Maze District. His camera was found lodged between rocks, containing only black frames. No patterns were officially acknowledged, yet independent researchers began cataloging them as part of a larger anomaly. By late 2021, Reeves's camera had become an artifact of competing narratives, the official version insisting on misadventure, and the suppressed evidence hinting at something methodical, patterned, and possibly deliberate. The photographs, most unseen by the public, remained the only testimony of his final days. They painted a picture not of a man wandering aimlessly, but of someone documenting signs, tracking shapes, and trying to leave behind a record. 9 years after his disappearance, Reeves's presence lingered not in bones or belongings, but in 183 frames of sand, stone, and shadows, an unfinished story that investigators seemed unwilling to complete. For those who studied the images, the conclusion was unavoidable. He had not simply been lost. He had seen something, followed it, and in the end, tried to show us what was waiting in the canyons. When the withheld photographs finally began to leak in greater numbers, a darker layer of the Reeves mystery emerged. Independent investigators who examined the files noted that the final 40 images bore almost no resemblance to ordinary landscape photography. Instead, they documented a progression, what looked like Reeves tracking something across the canyon floor. The early shots in this sequence showed cairns stacked in unnatural angles, some leaning forward as if poised to topple, but never falling. Later images depicted narrow slot canyons where spirals had been etched into the sand with precision. Each spiral grew larger than the last, as if Reeves were following a trail of symbols rather than hiking randomly. By frame 162, investigators identified what appeared to be human footprints beside the spirals. They were inconsistent. One set seemed too small, another too wide, none matching Reeves's own boots. Soil compression analysis suggested multiple individuals had passed through, but the prints ended abruptly in flat stone. The next photo, frame 163, showed Reeves's shadow elongated across the sandstone wall. Analysts noted he was holding the camera low, as if trying not to be seen. It was frame 168 that disturbed experts most. In the blurred distance on a canyon rim, a figure could be made out, tall, narrow, indistinct. The metadata confirmed the shot was taken at 3:14 a.m. when moonlight was minimal. There was no reason Reeves should have been photographing at that hour without artificial light. The file was partially corrupted, but what remained suggested Reeves had not been alone in those canyons. Journalists pressed the FBI to comment on the figure. The response was categorical. Image quality insufficient for analysis. No evidence of additional subjects present. Yet internal lab notes leaked later referred to the shot as subject frame. The phrasing implied acknowledgement, if not explanation. Meanwhile, new testimony surfaced. A retired ranger who participated in the 2012 search admitted privately that he had been told to avoid certain side canyons. When asked why, he said only, "Command didn't want us drawing attention there." His statement hinted at a controlled search, one that may have bypassed the very areas where Reeves had wandered. The camera itself became a focal point of speculation. Why had Reeves buried it so carefully, wrapped in canvas, and sealed beneath compacted sand? Forensic analysts concluded the burial was deliberate, not accidental. Some suggested he had known he was being pursued and wanted to preserve a record in case he did not return. Others believed someone else buried the camera after Reeves vanished, choosing which evidence would survive. The audio fragments recovered from the memory card only deepened the unease. One file captured Reeves's breathing, ragged and quick, followed by the faint sound of stones clattering. A second recording contained what sounded like 3 knocks, evenly spaced, echoing through rock corridors. Specialists compared the acoustics to known canyon echo patterns and found inconsistencies. The reverberation seemed too short for the geography, as if the knocks were not natural sound, but generated closer to the microphone. Families of other missing hikers came forward in light of the revelations. A man whose brother had vanished in the Maze District in 2005 recalled hearing similar knocks on the night before his disappearance. Another family described finding their loved one's shoes stacked in a triangle near a trail, never acknowledged in police reports. Patterns began to emerge, stretching beyond Reeves's case into a web of desert vanishings. Reeves's sister received another blow when she learned his journal, supposedly collected from his vehicle in 2012, had been missing from evidence for years. A clerk admitted the notebook was never formally logged, though she recalled pages filled with sketches of spirals and notes about shapes in shadow. Whether the journal was lost, stolen, or deliberately removed has never been explained. By the close of 2021, the Reeves disappearance no longer fit into the framework of a hiker lost to harsh terrain. The camera's final images suggested surveillance, pursuit, and attempts to document patterns that should not have been there. With the family demanding the full release of all 183 photographs and authorities refusing, the case entered a new phase. Not just a question of what happened to Michael Reeves, but why the record of his final days had been fractured, censored, and partially buried along with him. The unanswered questions hung over the desert like the silence after a signal cuts out. Was Reeves trying to reveal something hidden in Canyonlands, or had someone, or something, made sure his voice would only be heard in fragments? By early 2022, the Reeves case had become a contested archive more than an investigation. Families, journalists, and independent researchers were chasing fragments, while officials repeated the same phrase, "No further information available." Yet the recovered photographs, even in partial leaks, kept drawing new eyes to the mystery. They did not just depict landscapes. They mapped a progression, an unbroken chain of images that suggested Reeves had been following something across the desert, something he believed mattered enough to record even as his situation deteriorated. Researchers reconstructed the timeline based on metadata. Reeves's photos stopped showing ordinary canyon scenery after October 5th. From then onward, his lens turned downward toward the ground, spirals, cairns, and impressions in sand. Analysts concluded that by then, Reeves was no longer photographing for art, but for documentation. "It reads like evidence gathering," one independent investigator wrote, as if he wanted to leave a trail of proof. This interpretation clashed with the official line, which still characterized the photos as unremarkable environmental images. Audio files buried in the memory card received further examination. One newly enhanced fragment revealed Reeves whispering a phrase, just 2 words, "Too close." The context was unclear. The recording captured his breath quickening, followed by silence, then the sound of pebbles sliding across rock as though someone or something had shifted nearby. Technicians confirmed the clip was authentic, with no signs of tampering, yet once again the file never appeared in public releases. Witnesses who had been ignored in 2012 began re-emerging. A retired helicopter pilot recalled a faint orange glow on the canyon floor during a night search, like lanterns set in a circle. Ground crews sent to investigate reported nothing unusual. Their radio dispatches from that night are missing 10 minutes of audio, listed in the archive as recording error. A volunteer searcher described stumbling across stacked stones on a ridge, each capped with a scrap of cloth, but when he flagged the location the next morning, the cairns were gone. His notes remained in his personal logbook but were absent from official records. Patterns across other cases in the region grew impossible to ignore. Between 1995 and 2019, at least 8 disappearances in southern Utah involved artifacts later recovered in strange arrangements: shoes in circles, packs stacked in threes, or cairns aligned to compass points. None of these incidents were ever linked publicly. The Trail Anomaly Project, which had cataloged such cases, added Reeves's spiral photographs to their archive, noting eerie consistency across decades. The psychological weight on Reeves's family deepened. His sister described recurring anonymous messages, emails with single attachments of blurred spirals scratched into sand. The metadata of the images traced to anonymous servers, impossible to locate. In one case, the background of the photograph matched a ridge near Salt Creek, where Reeves's camera had been buried. The FBI dismissed the messages as hoaxes, but the timing of their appearance, just after the camera's recovery, unnerved investigators. Archaeologists also stepped reluctantly into the conversation. While spirals were known symbols in Pueblo and rock art, their recurrence in Reeves's photos, drawn fresh in sand, seemed out of place. A leaked correspondence between two university researchers suggested the spirals might represent boundary markers, noting that Reeves's sequence of photographs traced a line between major archaeological sites. Whether coincidence or design, the implication was that Reeves had been moving through a mapped pattern, not wandering at random. By mid-2022, the competing narratives hardened. Officials insisted Reeves was another tragic hiker lost to the unforgiving desert, but the suppressed evidence, corrupted audio, withheld photographs, erased dispatch logs, told a different story. Independent investigators saw a pattern of concealment, not incompetence. It's not just what they found, one journalist wrote, it's what they keep erasing. For Reeves's family, part 5 of the story was no longer about finding his remains. It was about preserving the fragments he left behind. Each spiral, each blurred figure, each knock on the audio files became pieces of testimony that someone wanted buried. The real question was no longer how Reeves died in the desert, but what he had uncovered in those canyons, and why so many forces seemed intent on making sure the full record would never be seen. By the 9th year after Michael Reeves vanished, the investigation had less to do with recovering a missing man than with confronting an archive that resisted resolution. The release of fragments, photographs, corrupted audio, and suppressed testimonies had created a paradox. Each new clue seemed to pull investigators closer to understanding, yet with every layer uncovered, a deeper silence followed. Reeves's disappearance was no longer treated as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a repeating pattern that the desert had concealed for decades. Forensic breakthroughs began quietly surfacing in late 2022. A technician at the state lab leaked that several of the shoes captured in Reeves's photographs, spirals and cairns included, had been traced to other unsolved cases. One pair matched a missing hiker from 1998. Another resembled a brand discontinued in the 1970s. Soil samples taken from the sites Reeves photographed revealed plant matter from ecosystems scattered across the Southwest: pine from Colorado, saltbush from southern New Mexico, and even traces of desert varnish found in Nevada. None of it belonged naturally to the Salt Creek drainage. To forensic analysts, the evidence suggested the spirals were constructed over time, layered artifacts that predated Reeves's journey. Audio technicians working independently enhanced one of Reeves's corrupted recordings further. What emerged was faint but distinct. 3 knocks, followed by a sound like fabric brushing against stone, then a whispered word, "Behind." Debate raged over whether it was Reeves's voice or interference, but its placement in the sequence, coming just before the final blurred photographs of a figure on a ridge, left little room for comfort. Witnesses who had kept quiet for years began speaking. A retired ranger recalled that during the 2012 search, K-9 units alerted violently in a narrow canyon off Salt Creek. Handlers were instructed to pull back immediately, told the area was unstable. The ranger admitted later he suspected the dogs were responding to something more than geology. Another volunteer reported hearing what he described as chanting carried by wind, faint but rhythmic. When he raised it with command, he was told to stop speculating. Psychological effects on those who entered the canyons continued long after. Several searchers described recurring dreams, walking barefoot in spirals, hearing static and knocks, waking to find sand in their beds. A clinical psychologist who interviewed them concluded that the similarity of their accounts pointed to shared traumatic imprinting, though she admitted she had never seen such uniformity in unrelated subjects. Independent investigators traced Reeves's path more carefully. By plotting the GPS metadata from his photographs, they realized he had not been wandering randomly, but following a rough arc through the Canyonlands, one that mirrored ancient petroglyph maps etched into rock faces miles away. The spirals he documented aligned with these carvings, as though Reeves had stumbled upon modern echoes of ancient symbols. Whether he understood what he was documenting is unclear, but his decision to bury the camera suggested he knew it carried significance. The FBI's silence grew heavier. Journalists pressing for full release of the photographs were told the case was closed, yet leaked emails between field agents revealed instructions to classify certain images as environmental anomalies requiring containment. The phrasing suggested bureaucratic management of evidence, not pursuit of answers. Families demanded transparency, but their requests were met with form letters. Reeves's sister began her own investigation. She obtained older maps of Canyonlands and noticed something striking. The location where the camera was buried sat precisely on a line connecting two clusters of ancient ruins known for spiral petroglyphs. Whether coincidence or intent, the burial site seemed chosen with precision. "It's not just where he died," she told reporters. "It's where someone wanted his record to wait." By the end of 2022, the Reeves case stood as a fractured record of spirals, shadows, and suppressed evidence. The sixth chapter of the mystery was not about discovery, but about recognition. That what Reeves encountered had likely existed long before him, that others had walked into the same silence, and that the geometry of the desert was more deliberate than officials would admit. Reeves's photographs had preserved what his body never could, proof of a pattern repeating across decades, one carefully hidden, yet still visible to anyone willing to look. The silence of the authorities left the question hanging over the desert like an echo. Was Reeves documenting ancient symbols, or had he stumbled into something that continued to mark its presence in stone, sand, and spirals long after the living disappeared? By the beginning of 2023, the Reeves case had transformed into an obsession for investigators outside official channels. Independent researchers, journalists, and even retired law enforcement officers were combing through every scrap of information, leaked photographs, corrupted audio, ranger testimonies, trying to piece together what the official narrative had deliberately left blank. What had started as a disappearance had become a collision between silence and evidence, each new discovery pulling the story further into territory that resisted conventional explanation. The seventh layer of the mystery revolved around the people who entered the canyon after Reeves. Several volunteers from the original 2012 search came forward with claims they had long suppressed. One described how, while sweeping a sidewash, he discovered a circle of stones partially buried in sand, each capped with fragments of shoe leather. When he reported it, the area was immediately sealed off by federal agents, who told him he had stumbled on sensitive cultural artifacts. Yet later, when he returned on his own, the site had been cleared. Every stone, every scrap removed. The psychological imprint of the search also grew clearer. 3 members of the volunteer team reported recurring disturbances, nightmares of walking barefoot through spirals, unexplained sleep paralysis, and in one case, hearing Reeves's name whispered while awake. These accounts might have been dismissed as trauma responses, but the uniformity of the imagery, the spirals, the feeling of pursuit, the presence of whispers, mirrored details from Reeves's own recovered audio. At the same time, the Trail Anomaly Project began compiling historical accounts of similar patterns. Their archive listed 32 disappearances across the Southwest since the 1960s that involved spirals, stacked stones, or artifacts arranged deliberately. In 1978, a family camping near Moab reported finding children's shoes arranged in a line that vanished into slick rock. In 1994, a hunter in Arizona vanished, after radioing that he had found something carved in sand, like a map. His rifle was later found balanced upright between stones. Reeves's 183 photographs now seemed less like an isolated clue and more like a continuation of a recurring design that stretched across geography and decades. Forensic specialists reanalyzed Reeves's images with new software. They identified faint etchings on canyon walls that his camera had inadvertently captured, marks resembling spirals carved directly into the rock. Some of these were not listed in archaeological surveys, suggesting they were either overlooked or deliberately undocumented. The positions aligned with the spirals Reeves photographed in sand, creating a chain that traced through Salt Creek toward remote, uncharted areas. The burial of the camera itself became the most disturbing piece. Forensic geologists studying the soil around the find site concluded the sand above the camera had been compacted deliberately. Not just buried, one expert said off record, packed, sealed, like someone wanted it to last. The implication was clear. If Reeves buried it himself, he was not leaving random artifacts behind. He was trying to ensure someone, someday, would see what he had recorded. If someone else buried it, then they had chosen which record would remain and which would vanish. Family members felt the weight of this implication most. Reeves's sister began keeping a private log of anonymous communications she had received since 2021, emails from untraceable sources, images of spirals drawn in dust, even a package containing a stone with fabric tied around it. Each seemed designed not to answer, but to remind her that the story was not finished. Law enforcement dismissed these as hoaxes. Yet the fabric in the package, when tested independently, was a polyester blend discontinued in the early 1990s, the same era connected to other missing hikers cataloged by the Trail Anomaly Project. Meanwhile, journalists digging into Park Service records uncovered an unpublished internal briefing from the mid-2000s. The document warned of geometrical markers discovered in multiple parks, instructing staff to secure sites and refrain from public documentation. Reeves's photographs, 9 years later, mirrored those warnings almost exactly. The withheld images were no longer simply evidence of his last days. They were part of a continuity the federal government had acknowledged internally, but never explained publicly. By the seventh stage of the case, one truth had become unavoidable. Reeves's disappearance was not just the loss of a man in the wilderness. It was a chapter in an ongoing pattern that someone, whether individuals, institutions, or something less definable, was actively managing, erasing, and controlling. The spirals were not random, the cairns not accidental, and the silence not benign. The canyon had swallowed Michael Reeves, but his buried camera had spoken louder than any official report. It suggested the presence of something methodical, deliberate, and continuing, and with each erased dispatch log, each vanished artifact, each redacted photograph, the impression grew that this was not only about what Reeves saw, it was about what someone has always wanted, kept hidden in the desert silence. By 2024, the Reeves case had become something between a legend and an open wound. It was no longer contained to Canyonlands, no longer dismissed as a tragic accident. Independent investigations, leaks, and testimonies had turned it into a symbol of something larger, a pattern of vanishings, spirals, and deliberate silence. The 8th year of renewed scrutiny brought with it new evidence and deeper fractures in the narrative. One of the most disturbing discoveries came from reanalysis of Reeves's GPS metadata. When plotted against historic survey maps, his movement in the final days did not trace random wandering, but a rough geometric arc connecting 3 ancient sites: petroglyph walls near Peekaboo Spring, an abandoned miners' camp from the early 1900s, and the unmarked wash where his camera was ultimately found. Archaeologists pointed out that the arc was nearly identical to the alignment of 3 spiral petroglyphs documented in the 1930s and later lost to erosion. Reeves seemed to have followed a line inscribed not just on the land, but in history. Meanwhile, a new leak emerged from within the Park Service. An internal training slideshow, circulated only among senior rangers, contained one slide titled Geometrical Incidents. Photographs showed spirals etched in sand, cairns capped with scraps of fabric, and circles of footwear. The note beneath read, "Secure, do not document publicly, refer to interagency protocol." The existence of the file was never acknowledged, but it matched too closely with Reeves's final photographs to dismiss. Witness testimony continued to resurface. A hiker who had been in Salt Creek during the 2012 search admitted that on the night of October 7th, he saw what he thought were lanterns moving in a slow circle across a ridge. The lights were silent, too evenly spaced to be headlamps. He assumed it was a ranger search team, but later learned no operations were logged in that area. His statement was recorded in his personal notes, but never taken by law enforcement. A retired volunteer searcher recalled a similar event in 2005, when he saw lights forming a spiral near the Maze district just before another hiker disappeared. The photographs themselves became more unnerving the longer they were studied. Independent image analysts enhanced frame 171, one of the blurred night shots, and identified at least 3 distinct figures standing along a canyon rim. Their silhouettes were faint, elongated, distorted by low light, but they were there. The FBI continued to insist the images showed natural rock formations, yet their own internal notes, later leaked, listed the file under the heading Unidentified Subjects. Even more troubling were the soil analyses. Independent labs confirmed that sediment clinging to Reeves's boots, visible in close-up photographs, contained traces of volcanic ash not found anywhere in the immediate Canyonlands region. Samples matched deposits from over 200 miles away in northern Arizona. The finding raised a grim possibility. Either Reeves had walked far outside the documented search zones in a matter of days, or the ground where he stood had somehow carried material from elsewhere. Neither explanation fit conventional logic. For the families, the 8th year was unbearable. Reeves's sister described receiving another anonymous package, this time containing a printed photograph she had never seen before. Reeves's own face, illuminated by a flash, eyes wide, mouth half open as if caught mid-breath. The metadata on the print was stripped, but forensic inspection confirmed it was shot with the same camera found in 2021. The image was not among the 183 photos on the recovered card. Where had it come from? Who had kept it for nearly a decade before sending it to his family? The psychological toll deepened further. Rangers who had entered the canyon in 2012 began to speak of long-term effects: night terrors, compulsive sketching of spirals, even aversions to returning to the desert. One admitted he resigned early because he felt watched every time the wind fell silent. Psychologists studying the case described it as collective imprint trauma, but the recurrence of the same imagery across unrelated individuals made the explanation ring hollow. The 8th stage of the Reeves case no longer centered on whether he had died in the desert. It centered on the patterns left behind, patterns repeating across decades, geography, and testimonies. His disappearance was one in a series, linked not just by shoes, spirals, and cairns, but by erasures, redactions, and silence. By the close of 2024, the Canyonlands no longer seemed like empty wilderness. They seemed mapped, marked, and patrolled by something that arranged evidence with deliberate geometry. Reeves's camera, buried like a message in a bottle, had cracked open a window. What it revealed was not just a man's last journey, but a presence that persisted long after, rearranging the ground, erasing the files, and leaving behind a single question that no official record dared to answer. Was Michael Reeves documenting what haunted him, or had he become part of the pattern itself? By 2025, the Reeves case had reached a point where every new lead blurred the line between investigation and containment. The camera was no longer just a relic of a disappearance. It had become a focal point in a conflict over truth itself. Independent researchers continued to publish findings, while official agencies tightened their grip. issuing terse denials and quietly pulling documents from archives that had stood unchallenged for years. What remained was a dossier stitched together by fragments, leaks, and testimonies that refused to stay buried. One of the most explosive developments came from a whistleblower within the forensic lab that had first processed Reeves's camera. The technician, speaking under anonymity, revealed that more than 183 photos had been recovered. According to her account, at least 7 additional frames existed, corrupted but partially restorable, showing Reeves turning the camera on himself. In one, his face appeared blurred, streaked with motion, as though he had been running. In another, light flared unnaturally behind him, a pale band across the sky. These images, she claimed, were withheld entirely, classified before the family or investigators ever knew they existed. The technician's testimony could not be corroborated, but it aligned with the strange single photograph mailed anonymously to Reeves's sister the year before. Simultaneously, dispatch logs resurfaced from October 9, 2012, the final date in the camera's metadata. At 02:47 hours, a ranger's radio recorded 30 seconds of static, interrupted by 3 low tones, evenly spaced, followed by silence. The incident was flagged in the original file, but marked equipment malfunction. Audio engineers revisiting the tape insisted the tones were intentional signals, not mechanical error. One described them as consistent with coded pulses, not radio interference. Civilian accounts added to the unease. A backpacker who returned to the Salt Creek area in 2019 revealed he had found a cairn capped with a single shoe, half buried, pointing west. He photographed it, but never reported the discovery, fearing ridicule. When he later compared his image with Reeves's photographs, the shoe was identical to one seen in the spiral sequence. If authentic, it meant someone, or something, had continued to arrange artifacts years after Reeves vanished. The psychological weight of these revelations began to fracture even seasoned investigators. Volunteers from the 2012 search admitted in interviews that they avoided returning to Canyonlands. One confessed to hearing Reeves's voice in dreams, whispering fragments of words, "Closer, turn, wait." Another described recurring visions of walking barefoot over hot stone, always in circles that never closed. Clinical experts labeled these experiences post-traumatic manifestations, but the recurrence of identical imagery across individuals suggested something more. The family, still demanding full release of the photographs, launched a civil suit against federal agencies. In hearings, government lawyers argued that the unreleased frames contained sensitive material irrelevant to the disappearance. Yet internal filings, briefly visible in court before being sealed, referred to the images as non-public anomalous evidence. The language confirmed what investigators long suspected. Reeves's photographs had crossed into a category that officials sought not to explain, but to suppress. As journalists dug deeper, they found older precedents. Reports from the 1970s and 1980s described disappearances across Utah and Arizona, where cameras were recovered containing inexplicable frames, blurs of light, spirals etched in sand, indistinct figures. None were ever made public. Reeves's case was not unique, only the latest entry in a concealed archive. By the end of 2025, the story had shifted irrevocably. Reeves's disappearance was no longer just about a photographer lost in Canyonlands. It was about a pattern repeating through time: spirals, cairns, shoes, signals, and photographs that surfaced only to vanish again under the weight of classification. The 9th chapter closed not with answers, but with a standoff. On one side, the family and independent investigators, insisting the evidence spoke to something larger than misadventure. On the other, official silence, preserving the boundaries of what could be admitted. What lingered in between was the sense that Reeves had captured something he was never meant to see, and that the desert, with its spirals and silences, was still arranging its patterns for whoever might be watching next. Nearly a decade after Michael Reeves disappeared into the sandstone labyrinth of Canyonlands, His case has hardened into something that resists closure. It no longer lives only in the official file stamped missing, presumed deceased. It persists in the leaks, the suppressed images, the whispered testimonies, and the spiral marks in sand that keep reappearing long after the search ended. The desert has become less a backdrop than a participant, silent, deliberate, and patient. For investigators outside the system, the 183 recovered photographs have become scripture. Each frame is studied not only for what it shows, but for what it implies. Spirals carved in dust, cairns balanced too precisely, shadows where no one should have been standing. Experts argue over the blurred figures, the corrupted audio, the sudden disappearance of footprints in Reeves's sequence. No consensus emerges, only layers of speculation. Was Reeves documenting human activity, ritualistic, clandestine, concealed, or was he capturing something older, something bound to the land long before parks and maps were drawn? The official stance remains unchanged. Agencies continue to state that Reeves likely died of exposure, his camera buried by natural forces. But the language of their internal memos tells a different story. Anomalous evidence, containment priority, non-public classification. These are not phrases used to describe misadventure. They are phrases that signal a decision has been made, not to investigate further, but to manage what has already been uncovered. For the family, the toll is immeasurable. Reeves's sister continues to receive anonymous communications, photographs of spirals drawn in dust, stones wrapped in cloth, even copies of images that were never supposed to leave FBI storage. Each arrival keeps the wound open, each artifact reminding her that Michael's story was interrupted, not finished. She describes living in a perpetual search, unable to mourn, unable to stop looking. Researchers who entered the canyon years later report the same unease as the original searchers. Some describe hearing knocks at night, others finding fresh cairns outside their tents, still damp with morning dew. A few refuse to speak at all, saying only that the silence feels wrong. Their experiences echo the fragments from Reeves's audio files, footsteps, whispers, knocks, suggesting that whatever Reeves encountered has not ended, only continued without him. The broader pattern, traced across decades of disappearances in the Southwest, is undeniable. Shoes arranged in circles, radios cutting into static, signals of 3 knocks repeating across time and space. Reeves's case fits seamlessly into this sequence, but with one critical difference. His camera survived, carrying with it a record of the geometry others only hinted at. That survival has made his disappearance not just another unsolved mystery, but a window into something larger, concealed, and ongoing. As the 10th year closes, the legacy of Michael Reeves rests not in closure, but in the questions his buried camera left behind. Who, or what, arranged the spirals? Why were photographs classified as though they contained national secrets? Was Reeves documenting patterns that human hands created, or did he stumble into something far older, something that watches from the edges of the desert? The final line of the official case file remains unchanged. Subjects not located. But in the shadows of Canyonlands, in the silence between stone walls, the patterns persist. Spirals reappearing, cairns rebuilt, shoes left where no one should be walking. And the question left for anyone who dares to look is the same one that haunted Reeves in his last days. What really followed him out there? And why does it still linger in the desert silence?